The public is being sold a $151 billion mathematical certainty, a missile defense contract designed not to prevent a war, but to price one in. While the media fixates on the kinetic spectacle of launch on warning, the actual vector of attack is silent. It travels not through the air, but through the deep. An exchange of strategic warheads is a solvency crisis for all parties, a known liability. The asymmetric threat is not a storm of fire. It is an engineered silence. An adversary doesn't need to obliterate a city to win. They only need to sever its nerves. The blueprint targets two systemic vulnerabilities. First, the undersea data cables that carry over 99% of global communications and trillions in daily financial transactions. Second, the satellite constellations providing command, control, and precision navigation. These are not military targets. They are cognitive and economic ones. The objective is not asset destruction, but asset paralysis. This is the protocol to create the blind Leviathan, a superpower with a fleet it cannot command, an air force it cannot direct, and a market it cannot access. A solvent state made instantly, systemically illiquid. It is a paper tiger, functionally neutralized without a single kinetic strike on its soil. The motive is not ideology, it is insolvency. When a nation-state's liabilities exceed its assets, it defaults. The primary asset is not its military, but its internal stability. The primary liability is not debt, but domestic political chaos. Analysts at CSIS confirm that for a state like Russia, an unpopular war functions as a catastrophic domestic liability, draining political capital and accelerating a systemic solvency crisis. The state is forced to find a cheaper, more effective form of leverage. This is the pivot to asymmetry. Conventional warfare is prohibitively expensive. It requires social cohesion and unbreakable alliances, assets now fractured and incalculable. Reports of violent mobs hunting political opponents in American cities are not isolated incidents. They are data points measuring the decay of internal stability. Concurrently, documents from the New York Times and the Chosun Ilbo confirm that foundational pillars like the 80-year Atlantic Alliance are threatened by trade and territorial disputes. The capacity for sustained, conventional power projection is mathematically degraded. A state facing a solvency crisis has two options: accept systemic collapse or force a reset. Asymmetric escalation, the threat of a limited, overwhelming kinetic strike, becomes the only rational strategic tool. It is infinitely cheaper than a protracted, losing conventional war that guarantees regime change. The threshold for a launch on warning protocol is no longer determined by external aggression, but by internal political bankruptcy. Weakness does not invite a symmetric response, it forces an asymmetric one. This is not a forecast, it is an accounting of risk. The recent $151 billion Missile Defense Agency contract is not a statement of strength. It is a balance sheet entry. It is the cost of insuring against an event that strategic accountants now view as a statistical probability. They are not hedging against an enemy's strength, but against the calculated desperation born from their engineered weakness. The math is irrefutable. Internal decay is the primary accelerant for nuclear conflict. The mathematical foundation of conventional deterrence is now insolvent. This insolvency is driven by a simple, brutal equation. The Royal United Services Institute, RUSI, quantifies the new kinetic cost curve. A $5 million main battle tank can be neutralized by a $500 drone. This is not a tactical nuisance. It is a systemic economic attack. This is the democratization of violence, the decoupling of destructive capability from state-level capital investment. Any actor, state or non-state, can now achieve a cost-per-kill ratio previously reserved for superpowers. This economic inversion renders legacy platforms and the trillions invested in them a strategic liability. An adversary no longer needs to match our force structure. They only need to achieve a cost imbalance so severe that our defense leads to national bankruptcy. The $151 billion missile defense contract is not a show of strength. It is the actuarial admission of this very vulnerability, a desperate, mathematically losing attempt to counter an attack that costs fractions of a penny on the dollar to launch. This is the blueprint for asymmetric escalation, using economic attrition to force a kinetic response on terms favorable to the attacker. The front line is no longer a line on a map. It is a distributed network of proxy laboratories, controlled environments designed to stress test our systemic solvency. What you see as random chaos, such as the NGO-funded mobs in Minneapolis, is a clinical experiment. These are not protests. They are domestic gray zones, deployed to measure the exact breaking point of civil order and quantify the decay of state authority. The objective in these labs is not to win the street. It is to gather data. The footage of counter-protesters being attacked is input. The metric is the state's response time, or lack thereof. Analysts at CSS confirm this blueprint. Create a kinetic event, document the paralysis, and feed the data into an escalation matrix. The goal is to determine the precise level of internal rot required before external leverage can be applied with mathematical certainty. This protocol is scalable. The same vector used to fracture a city block is used to fracture a hemisphere. Reports of a trade war over Greenland threatening the 80-year Atlantic Alliance were not about territory. It was a geostrategic gray zone operation. The Greenland dispute was the leverage point, selected specifically to test the structural integrity of the alliance. The result was a documented systemic failure. Therefore, indicators of regional instability, travel warnings, political turmoil are merely symptoms. These are deployed gray zones, functioning as staging areas. According to RUSI, adversaries utilize these proxy laboratories to rehearse hybrid warfare tactics, bleed Western resources, and exhaust political capital without triggering a conventional response. It is a war of 1,000 cuts, designed to induce a systemic solvency crisis before a single shot is fired in the homeland. The data from every gray zone, domestic and foreign, feeds one single calculation: the threshold for asymmetric escalation. The internal political chaos directly lowers the adversary's perceived cost for a limited, overwhelming kinetic strike. The $151 billion Missile Defense Agency contract is not a deterrent. It is the irrefutable mathematical admission that the data from these labs has already proven the system is brittle enough to invite that very strike. This isn't a possibility. It is an anticipated outcome. The Launch on Warning Protocol is not a policy of aggression. It is a mathematical solution to a time solvency crisis. Given the flight time of an intercontinental ballistic missile, a nation-state has under 30 minutes to detect a launch, verify its trajectory, and decide whether its entire command structure and kinetic arsenal are about to be liquidated. The protocol is an automated response function. Upon high-confidence detection of an inbound strategic attack, a retaliatory launch is executed before the first enemy warhead impacts. It is a machine built to preempt total paralysis. This entire architecture is predicated on a single fragile assumption: the absolute integrity of its data. The system requires perfect, uninterrupted information from its network of satellites and ground-based radar. Yet this system does not operate in a stable environment. It operates against a backdrop of engineered internal decay, with reports of mob-led street violence in cities like Minneapolis and the systemic fracturing of foreign alliances as documented in disputes threatening the 80-year Atlantic Alliance. Each event adds a stress coefficient to the decision-making matrix. This is the entry point for asymmetric warfare. An adversary does not need to launch a multi-billion-dollar missile. They need only deploy a comparatively low-cost cyber weapon to blind the early warning network. This creates the fog of digital war. On the command screen, the data feeds from NORAD simply vanish. The screen goes black. The commander is now forced into an impossible binary. Is this a system failure? A technical glitch? Or is this the opening move of a decapitation strike with the incoming warheads deliberately masked by the cyber attack? The launch on warning protocol, designed to ensure a response, now acts as a trap. The fear of being disarmed, of waiting and discovering the attack was real, becomes the primary accelerant. The commander is forced to launch out of fear. This is the mathematical certainty that internal national decay directly and measurably lowers the threshold for nuclear conflict. The systemic decay is not a bug. It is the core function. Reports document violent political mobs creating domestic strategic liabilities as seen in Minneapolis. Simultaneously, diplomatic leverage is deliberately sacrificed, with disputes over assets like Greenland threatening to trigger an 80-year Atlantic Alliance collapse. This creates a pre-calculated vector for an adversary. This engineered vulnerability is the collateral for a kinetic event. The recent authorization of a $151 billion contract for the Missile Defense Agency is not a deterrent. It is the mathematical admission that a launch-on-warning scenario is anticipated. The internal political chaos directly lowers the threshold for an adversary to calculate a successful first strike. The final variable required is a test of the system's paralysis. Expect a calibration shot within the next 12 months. An attribution impossible cyber-physical event targeting the primary data clearinghouse for the Port of Los Angeles and Long Beach. The objective is not destruction, but measurement, to quantify the delay in response as domestic factions blame each other and fractured allies remain silent. It is the final data point before initiating an asymmetric escalation.